Bruges has often been described as the Venice of the North, and in a way one just has to look at old photographs of the town to realize how apt the nickname is. Bridges reflected in the motionless water of canals, and though Bruges has become today one of the favorite goals of British day trippers going to Europe to buy endless quantities of bottles of beer to bring back to England, Bruges remains nevertheless one of the cultural centres of European civilization, probably best represented in the most famous literary work it ever inspired, which is called, even in English, Bruges la Morte, Dead Bruges, or Bruges the Dead One, by a man called Georges Rodenbach. In this drawing by Fernand Knopf, a very famous Belgian symbolist painter who was obsessed with Rodenbach's novel, we immediately perceive the association between the dead city and the dead woman. In fact, the wife of the hero of Bruges la Morte, a man called Hugues Viane. And we can see that Bruges appealed particularly to the sensitiveness of end-of-century Europe because of the connection between death and femininity. The book is regularly reprinted in paperback editions, which of course prove its popularity even today. Knopf, already mentioned, was, as I said, obsessed with Bruges, partly because it was his native town, and though he spent most of his life in Brussels, he retained extremely intense memories of Bruges, to which he returned time and time again in absolutely exceptional drawings, which emulate by their precision photography and yet retain a strange and amazing poetry of their own. Here we have a self-portrait by the extremely elegant and refined Fernand Knopf, again one perhaps the most important symbolist painter in the Belgium of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Evidently, the photographs that we have of end-of-century Bruges are completely connected with Knopf's vision, and here we have something very interesting, which is the kind of evocation in the background of Bruges that we have already seen both in photographs and in Knopf's drawings, but this is again by Knopf, and it's in fact a portrait of the author of Bruges la Morte, Georges Rodenbach, by Knopf himself. So we really have a kind of symbiosis between, on the one hand, visual arts and literary arts, on the one hand Knopf, and on the other Rodenbach, and they both contribute to produce an image of Bruges which is at the same time extremely seductive and dangerous, because it is of course the seduction of immobility and death. On the left hand side we have a painting by Knopf, early painting by Knopf, representing Bruges in winter, where Bruges seems to be enshrouded in the whiteness of snow. And on the right-hand side, we have a combination of two images, a tondo, a red painting or image, and a rectangular drawing at the bottom. Knopf was particularly keen on these associations of paintings which appealed to the reverie tendency in him and in his spectators, the association between a young woman, in fact his elder sister, Marguerite, and the town of Bruges in a frame that he probably designed himself. And we can see that Marguerite, painted by Fernand, her brother, is holding in her hand a mask, the mask of Hypnos. This mask of Hypnos was created both in sculpture and in painting by Fernand Knopf on the model of a Greek mask of Hypnos he had seen in the British Museum of London. And of course, Hypnos means sleep. It means, of course, in a way, a kind of premonition or equivalent of death. And what is very interesting is that the Musée d'Orsay owns a photograph of Marguerite holding the mask of Hypnos, which was used by Knopf as a basis for the pastel we were looking at earlier on. So we see that, in a way, Knopf is at the same time celebrating a kind of dead city, something which seems to have broken any kind of link with modernity, and at the same time he is using photography, the most modern of all media at the time, to prepare for his own artistic representations. Bruges, as I said, we now have the rectangular part, the bottom of the double image we saw earlier on, in which we see the reflection of the Hôpital Saint-Jean, to which we will come back. And again, we have this extraordinary impression of something which is almost totally immobile, if it were not for the extremely delicate and almost invisible ripples at the surface of the water. And this reflection, this vertical reflection of the building in water, suggests a kind of total immobility. Knopf was obsessed, as I said, with Bruges, and on endless occasions he came back to this vision of the city almost sinking into its own image, disappearing into its own image. All the major quays of Bruges along the canals were obsessional elements of Knopf's own imaginary universe. Here we have the back of the Church of Our Lady and the Hôtel Gruthus, the man who was Charles V's representative in Bruges, on the left. And endlessly we see, of course, Knopf coming back to various favorite views of Bruges. On the left-hand side here we have a photograph, Knopf in the painting. On the right-hand side, in the image, on the right-hand side, associates the theme of water with the theme of the mirror, the reflection, and he provides a kind of ironical counterpoint to the gate on the left, with the young lady's face on the right, because in fact the gate on the left is the gate to the béguinage. This absolutely, we have again here a photograph of the bridge leading to the béguinage, which we have already seen, and its vision by Knopf. So we see that Knopf is constantly, in that sense, he is not just a poet of the past, but he is an extremely astute artist, because he's constantly playing with the possibilities of photography instead of denying or refusing the challenge of photography. He is in fact accepting the challenge of photography, and by accepting it he is able to constantly question our eye on the validity or the supremacy of painting, in fact. To go back to the actual place, this gate still survives today. It is the gate, as we said earlier on, of the béguinage, and we have still today, though they are no longer béguines, they are actually the members of a religious order which has taken over the Béguinage, we can see one of the specificities of the Béguinage here. It was, and this of course also puts Bruges at the center of the development of European spiritual life. In the late Middle Ages, developed along the Rhine and in the Flanders a kind of spiritual trend, a movement which is called the Rhinish Flemish mystique, which was probably a kind of first premonition of the Reformation, since it tried to combine monastic life and the urban environment. Until then, all monasteries had been built in the depth of the natural world, in the middle of nowhere, and they were usually used as basis for the progression of civilization against the wilderness. And usually in monasteries, except of course in charter houses, the emphasis was put on community life. The Béguinage was a monastic institution in the middle of real life, in the middle of contemporary life, in the middle of the urban environment, and it insisted on the individuals as members of the community rather than as a community aggregating individuals. Hence, of course, the specific architecture of the Béguinage, where we can see that instead of emphasizing common buildings, the Béguinage was organized around the juxtaposition of individual houses. And these individual houses underline, of course, the importance of individual salvation. The Middle Age believed in collective civilization. You belonged to the church or you did not belong to it, and if you belonged to it, you hoped for salvation. If you did not belong to it, salvation was denied to you. The Béguinage marks inevitably a kind of deep and long-lasting evolution towards the final assertion of the supremacy of individualism in spiritual life as assessed later on by the Reformation and in the Counter-Reformation by the Jesuits. Now we have here, of course, two books which are devoted to a woman, Marguerite Porret. She came from Bruges. She's at the origin of the Béguine movement, and she's described in the book on the right as the inspiration of Maître Eckhart, Master Eckhart, who is usually regarded as one of the greatest late medieval mystic teachers and souls. And Maître Eckhart, as we can see here, was considered as one of the most brilliant minds of his time. He came from the Rhine Valley, and not only was he a brilliant philosopher, but he was also a brilliant sort of a spiritual master and teacher. His vision of nothingness has been usually described as a premonition of the dark night of the soul, as experienced later on by St. John of the Cross. And we see here where Bruges and the Béguinage, in a way, are part and parcel of this great process of individualization of faith, which led to the Reformation, but in the Roman Catholic Church led also to the experience of the Carmel with Saint Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, and as we have already said, the Jesuits. So we have, in fact, in Bruges, a kind of place where all sorts of aspects of burgeoning modernity, in particular in the field of philosophy and religion, can still be seen today. Johann Tauler was also one of the most famous figures of this Rhinish Flemish mystique or mystic tradition, and certainly the fact that the Béguinage is in Bruges means that people like Toller, people like Master Eckhart, were regularly read in Bruges at the time. And Lévy-Durmer, who along with Fernand Knopf is one of the most important of symbolist Belgian painters, has produced this rather staggering image of a begin, which is again one of the aspects of life in Bruges, which connects Bruges in its specificity with major trends of European cultural and spiritual life. Now let's for a moment remember where Bruges is situated. Bruges is situated on at a small distance from the North Sea, and we have immediately to remember that one of the tragedies of Bruges was the fact that it was normally connected with the sea by the Zwind, a kind of mixture of seawater and fresh water from a small river. This Zwind, which linked the sea with Bruges and Bruges with the sea, was absolutely essential for the economic life of Bruges, because it was through the Zwind that not only the wool from England came, which was transformed into, of course, cloth, which made the fortune of Bruges and which enabled Bruges to play the essential part it played in late medieval economic, mid-medieval and late medieval economic life in Europe. The Zwind is often mentioned in a famous work by Marguerite Yourcenar, which is the last section of which is entirely located in Renaissance Bruges, called L'œuvre noire, which is a reference, of course, to alchemy. The tragedy of Bruges is that the important leaders of Bruges economic life, in particular at the end of the 14th century and all along the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, were so obsessed by the production of wealth and the increase of wealth in the city that they completely forgot about the need to invest, or at least they forgot about the need to invest not just in technology, not just in raw materials, but also the need to invest in the environment. And they allowed, tragically enough, or stupidly enough, they allowed the Zwind to be gradually invaded by sand. And in the end, the Zwind lost its navigability, and inevitably trade and the influx of raw material and, of course, the sending of manufactured product, of proto-manufactured products toward various parts of the known world at the time, that became impossible, which had made the wealth of Bruges. And we see how along the coast of the North Sea, wealth migrated from Bruges to Antwerp as a result of this carelessness of the economic and political elites of the city. We have here a view of the Zwind today, which shows, of course, how, in a way, dangerous the geographical configuration of the Zwind was. Extremely slow water moving along meanders towards the sea, with the danger, with the tides, of course, of sand being brought in by the tides and left, of course, to gradually invade the bed of the Zwind, and the final catastrophe. This painting by Fernand Knopf, again, or this image by Fernand Knopf, again, is a very interesting image because it is a portrait of Bruges, which is at the same time realistic, because we have the famous, of course, Flemish houses with their pointed gables and their side steps, and we have at the same time a purely visionary element, which is this gradual invasion of the sea, except that Bruges was not finally drowned in the sea, but Bruges was drowned in the way, in the carelessness of its leaders. And just in front of the two gabled houses, we have the pedestal, and all the people who have been to Bruges know that this is normally the pedestal of the statue of Hans Memling. And of course, by removing the statue from the pedestal, probably Knopf was asserting a kind of decline and degradation of Bruges. We know that Knopf was absolutely obsessed by the paintings Memling left in the Hôpital Saint-Jean in Bruges, but as an adult, he never returned to see them. He wanted to preserve the memory he had of them as a child. And this, of course, is the famous Hôpital Saint-Jean. This is extremely interesting because somehow it connects with other places, which, for instance, the Hospice de Beaune in French Burgundy, which were commissioned, the Hospice in Beaune, by Nicolas Rollin. We know, of course, here that being a town, Bruges, the Hôpital Saint-Jean was commissioned by a group of wealthy citizens. But it seems to me very interesting that this, of course, the common project of civic responsibility towards the most vulnerable members of the community, in Beaune with Nicolas Rollin, in Bruges with a group of prominent citizens in the town, this common feeling that leadership means responsibility and means solidarity with the weaker members of the community. This is characteristic of, in a way, the Burgundian vision of the world. Let us not forget that what we call Flanders today, or at least Belgium today, was once part of Burgundy at a time when Burgundy was probably twice the size of England. I don't mean by that the United Kingdom, twice the size of England, and probably twice the size of France in those days. Burgundy today has completely disappeared, and the only idea we have of Burgundy is, of course, the Côte de Beaune, the Côte de Nuit, and the Côte de Chalon, the famous wines. But there was a time when Burgundy, of course, was a kind of proto-kingdom, if not a proto-empire. And in that kingdom or empire, in a constant quest for equilibrium between monarchical power and the political influence and responsibility of the financial, economic, and commercial elites, solidarity, probably towards the weaker members of the community, was seen as a sign of the general health of the community. We have here, of course, on the two portions of the polyptych of the two St. John's by Hans Memlings, we have, of course, this was the only part of the polyptych which was visible during the week. Kneeling on the floor, we have the four commissioners, donors. On the left-hand side, the two monks. On the right-hand side, the two nuns, and they are accompanied, of course, by their protector saints. We can imagine, or we can suppose, and in fact this is confirmed by document, but we are not going to go into all the names, that because of his walking stick on the left, the man kneeling at the extreme left was called James because he's protected by the traditional representation of Saint Anthony. The man on the right-hand side of the left-hand side panel is called Anthony. One of the most famous works in the Hôpital Saint-Jean is, of course, the famous triptych by Hans Memling. The two panels, which were visible every day of the week, whereas, of course, the triptych was opened on Sundays. The two panels represent the commissioners, the two brothers and the two nuns, the two monks and the two nuns, who actually commissioned and paid for the painting. It's perhaps not terribly important to know their actual names, but it's interesting to see that in this kind of representation, every individual is presented to God by his or her patron saint. On the left, of course, with his walking stick and his hat, St. James, and then St. Anthony. So the two men were called James and Anthony. On the right, of course, the two nuns. We have one saint accompanied by a lamb which can be seen between the two nuns, and that is, of course, St. Agnes. And on the right-hand side, we have, of course, the founder of the feminine version of the Franciscans, Santa Clara, St. Clare, who protects actually, or presents, introduces in the presence of God, one of the two nuns who commissioned the triptych. Now, each of the side panels, when the triptych is opens, presents, of course, aspects of the life of the two St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, who were the patron saints of the hospital. On the left-hand side here, we can see, of course, the beheading of St. John, after shown here on the right, but in fact in the background of the panel, as we can see on the left, after the famous dance by Salome. And later on, of course, on the right-hand side panel, we have a rather extraordinary representation on the right-hand side of St. John in the island of Patmos, writing the book of Revelation, whereas on the left of this slide, we have three details representing, according to Memling, aspects of the visions of St. John in the book of Revelation. And in the center, we have the mystical marriage of St. Catherine of Alexandria. St. Catherine is seen on the left, introduced in the presence of Christ and his mother by St. John the Baptist, whose story is told on the left of the triptych, and on the right-hand side we have St. John the Evangelist, who is represented on the right-hand side and introduces the visions of the Revelation that we have just seen. At the feet of St. John the Evangelist, St. Barbara, with the famous tower in which she was locked up by her father because she didn't want to marry a pagan man. She managed to bribe the builders of the tower into putting three openings in the tower so that she would be able constantly to meditate on the Holy Trinity. And whereas on the one hand we have the St. Catherine being united mystically to Christ, St. Barbara on the right-hand side is reading, of course, the Holy Scripture. This is St. John the Baptist, again, being arrested on the left, just behind him, preaching to the crowd a little bit further up in the painting. And on the right-hand side, we have the burning of the relics of St. John the Baptist by a pagan emperor, Julian the Apostate. And we can see, of course, we're not going to go into too many details now, but you can see that even the capitals are actually sculpted, and they represent, of course, usually episodes of the life of St. John the Baptist. The capital on the left represents the vision of Zechariah in the temple. Zechariah was John the Baptist's father, and he was told by an angel that though he and his wife were very old, his wife would become pregnant. Zechariah refused to believe the angel, and of course later on he turned dumb and only recovered speech after the birth of his son. What seems to me very important is that we have here a kind of gradual invading of the field of faith by images. More and more images are used as a kind of prop for the expression of individual and collective belief. In the representation, or behind the representation of St. John the Evangelist, everybody will recognize the chalice in which the wine in the chalice is turned into a snake. In fact, the high priest of the temple of Diana in Ephesus, resenting the popularity of John the Baptist, had sent him a gift of wine, and St. John was able to show that the wine was poisoned by when he lay his hand on the chalice, the glass, the chalice, he turned the wine into a snake. And what is very interesting is that the theme of drink, the theme of wine, is also represented behind St. John the Evangelist, by the great wheel. And this great wheel was in fact known by anybody and everybody in Bruges at the time, because it was used to unload the boats which arrived from Bordeaux loaded with casks of wine. So we can see gradually how what seems today to us what was for a long time. Now tourism has made of Bruges again a lively city. But for a long time, Bruges was a dead city, in total neglect of the extraordinary commercial and financial centrality which had been the characteristic of Bruges in the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries of European history. It seems to me also that probably we should be perhaps a little more attentive to the pride of Bruges. The pride of Bruges was, of course, weaving. And we can see here the importance of brocade. Brocade, which is represented either with pineapple or pomegranates, but the splendor, the beauty of this mixture of gold thread and velvet, which was the particular element or the most prestigious product of the Bruges economy. It's very interesting that these religious representations should also be at the same time a form of commercial advertising. In a sense, Memling was, of course, painting a religious subject, but he was using that religious subject as a basis to promote, of course, the specific contribution of Bruges to European economy at the time. And extremely important, we recognize, of course, it's very interesting to see how probably at the same time we have the wheel and the sword, which were the instruments of the martyrdom of St. Catherine of Alexandria. And we have extremely close to it a kind of claim on the part of Bruges to a superiority in the field of textile production, and of course a claim to a supremacy in the economic life of the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And inevitably, of course, the presence of an oriental carpet underlines necessarily the connections between Bruges and other parts of the world. We saw earlier on the wheel, which was used to unload the boats bringing the wine from Bordeaux to Bruges. We have seen a major export of Bruges brocade, and now we see that there is a major import oriental carpets. So we have in the paintings this kind of description of the visual proof, visual evidence for the fact that this town, which at the end of the 19th century was considered as the epitome of the dead town, something which had been and no longer was, this town was once at the center of the known world's economy. And so civilizations probably are mortal, as Paul Valéry said. Now this, of course, is a map of Bruges in the heyday of its glory, and I would like to insist for a moment on this engraving, which I think is particularly important, because we see what? We see the Boursia Brugensis, that is to say, the stock exchange. So this idea that we are in a town which was not just a town where objects were traded, but probably it was also a financial center, and that production and commercialization led inevitably to a dominant presence of finance. But more interesting perhaps than that, which is the kind of recognition that early on in the Middle Ages, Bruges already gathered together the major aspects of a modern economy: production, commercialization, and finally the temptation of finance. Perhaps more interesting even than that are the two inscriptions that we can see on the left and on the right of the engraving. Domus Genuensium, which means, of course, the house or the residence of the people from Genoa. And on the other side, Domus Florentinorum, so the house, the home, the residence of people from Florence. And again, we can see here that Bruges displays, perhaps for the first time in European history, this idea that there is no flourishing economy without commerce, without exchanges, without, of course, an open market and a free circulation of people, ideas, and goods. And of course, we have here one of the most essential presences in Bruges in the 15th century, a man called Giovanni Arnolfini, who represented one of the most powerful and one of the most wealthy families of bankers and traders in Genoa. Giovanni Arnolfini represented the interest of his family, of his Genoan family in Bruges, and of course, one day, or at some point in his presence in Bruges, he came across a man called Jan van Eyck. And on the left-hand side, of course, here, we have this famous portrait of the man with the red turban, which is thought to be a self-portrait by Jan van Eyck, though we are not sure. Whereas on the right-hand side, coming from the Gronau Museum in Bruges, we have what is universally now recognized and accepted as a portrait of Margaret van Eyck, Van Eyck's wife, in which, again, we can see, not just on the part of Van Eyck, the idea of saving his wife from annihilation and death by the preservation of her image, but also a kind of extraordinary display of the fantastic craftsmanship of Bruges lace makers. If you look at her hat, for instance, you will immediately recognize a fantastic mastery of the art of the cloth, which Van Eyck was only too pleased to reproduce or to imitate on his painting. And of course, Arnolfini and Van Eyck will remain forever in the history of world art because of this absolutely exceptional painting, which is now one of the jewels of the National Gallery in London. So we have a painting which is in London, but which was painted in Bruges by a man called Van Eyck for a merchant banker who came from Genoa, which in those days was pretty much a form of early globalization, right? And this in itself makes, of course, the portrait extremely interesting. You will again recognize the presence of the oriental carpet, which, like in Memling's painting later on, probably reveals the link, the commercial links between Bruges and distant parts of the world, the Middle East probably. The two, of course, slippers have been abandoned in the floor. Everybody knows, of course, who has heard of this painting, that we have the signature of Johann van Eyck above the famous mirror, Johann van Eyck Fuit Ik, right? Followed, of course, by the date, which is probably 1432. And then, of course, we have what remains still today one of the most amazing aspects of this painting, the convex mirror, also known as a witch mirror, and this convex mirror, of course, in which inevitably we are led to see in the at the very end of the perspective, probably Van Eyck's presence representing Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. And so almost right from the beginning of the history of modern painting, we have this essential question, which is at the heart of every painting, does painting consist in reproducing a kind of mirror-like vision of reality, or is painting a transformation of reality in order to make it say what the painter thinks it has to say? You can see here the extraordinary detail which enables us probably to see in the blue figure Van Eyck and in the red figure either an assistant of Van Eyck's or a friend of Tommaso Arnolfini's, or God knows what, but God knows who. But it is in itself a spatial construction which is so modern, right, which will be evoked later on by Velázquez in Las Meninas, and the presence of mirror in paintings, again taken up by Edouard Manet in Le Bar des Folies Bergères in the Porto Institute in London, all these presences of mirrors which are constantly challenging the ability of painting to mirror reality, or the need for painting either to mirror or to transgress reality. This comes directly from this painting, painted in Bruges to represent a Genoese couple. And that seems to me, again, to make of Bruges one of the very centers of European culture. Now, I'm showing you here a detail from a painting, which is going to be revealed in a minute, but probably, of course, some of you have already seen the painting. It is what you have just seen here is, in fact, the right-hand part of the shield of St. George. St. George is carrying his shield on his back, and on the right-hand side of his armor, on the shield, we can see again a reflection. And that reflection can only be, again, that of Van Eyck. So in the Arnolfini's portrait, there is, the presence of the mirror effect is not something which happened to cross Van Eyck's mind, or it is not something which happened to be in the room and was reproduced by Van Eyck as if he did not realize what he was doing. This kind of obsessional reflection of the painter in his own painting is extremely important. It announces very modern visions of painting, such as, for instance, the idea that the painting is not a reproduction of the reality, it is the manifestation of a unique and specific vision of that reality by the painter. And this, of course, is in the Gronin Museum in Bruges. On the right-hand side, kneeling at the feet of the Virgin Mary and Child Christ, a canon George van der Paal, introduced into the divine presence by his patron saint, St. George. And on the left-hand side, we have, of course, the patron saint of the church in which the painting was installed, a church which was known as Saint Donation, and of course it is Saint Donation who is represented here on the left. The painting at the time was organized along very, very strict lines of very strict norms of representation, but there was no norm of representation which said that the painter should should introduce his own image reflected in the painting. So Van Eyck's art is constantly a game between abiding by the rules, abiding by the norms, and at the same time transgressing the norms. Saint Donation is shown carrying or holding a wheel with lit up candles in his hand. It's very interesting to see that the decorations of his cope, are kind of icons with golden background. They refer to an archaic form of image, and those archaic forms of images are introduced into a very modern image, as if Van Eyck was constantly insisting on the notion of development in art, right? There was a time when we reproduced pictures of saints, but we were not interested, perhaps we thought we should not, perhaps we thought we could not reproduce the background, the landscape, the architecture in which the saint was presented. Today, we can do that. So there has been a progress and again, of course, when we see a painting like this, we are struck by this idea that Van Eyck was this entirely rooted Bruges man. This man was entirely aware of the fact that there was such a thing as progress in art, and there was such a thing as progress in the mimetic power of art. Now, why is he holding that wheel in his hand? Because he was murdered by the pagans, and then the pagans threw his corpse, his body, into the river, and his disciples did not know where he had been put into the river, abandoned to the river. So they put on the waters of the river a wheel. They lit up candles, so the wheel and the candles went downstream, and at one point suddenly the wheel stopped and would not be pushed along by the stream anymore. And of course they dived into the river, and lo and behold, underneath the wheel was of course Saint Donation's corpse. So you can see the combination of something which is completely legendary, reproduced in a technique which is highly advanced and extremely modern for the period. It is this combination of archaism and modernity, archaism in the subjects, modernity in the technique, which is so interesting in these paintings. We have here, of course, the presence of Mary, the Virgin, and Child Christ with the tapestry behind. And on the left-hand side, you can see Cain murdering Abel. And this, again, I find very interesting. This idea that no space is left empty of discourse. All the available space is saturated with discourse. Everything must have a meaning. Everything must contribute to the meaning. In the same way as Child Christ is holding a parrot in his hand, probably an allusion to the famous identification of St. Augustine with a parrot, constantly repeating, of course, and uttering the glory of God. And again, you can see the influence, the presence always of these oriental carpets, which constantly remind us in the here and now of the somewhere else, of the distance in space and time. And this, of course, brings us back to this vision of the presence of the Italian presence in Bruges. We have seen Arnolfini commissioning the portrait of himself and his wife on what is supposed to be their wedding dates and epithalamion, right? We have seen how Van Eyck was not only able to paint, or was not only asked to paint wealthy Italian residents in Bruges, but also local people, local priests. And we now move on to, of course, something very important, which is by Hans Memling. It's a double portrait. It's a portrait of Tommaso Portinari and his wife Maria. And Tommaso and Maria Portinari, Tommaso was in fact the Medici agent in Bruges. So again, we have here this idea that Bruges was not just connected with Genoa, it was also connected with the capital of the Renaissance, that is to say, Florence. And here we are barely at the end of the 15th century. So in fact, barely 40 or 50 years after the beginning of the Renaissance in Florence, Bruges, in a way, through the mediation of money, through the mediation of banking, through the mediation of commerce, Bruges was connected with the most advanced aesthetic aspects of the Florentine Renaissance. This is extremely interesting because it is a painting by Petrus Christus. Petrus Christus was a direct disciple of Van Eyck. He belongs to the great Bruges tradition of painting, whereas on the contrary, Memling, whom we saw earlier, had come via Tournai and Brussels from the tradition of Robert Campin and Roger van der Weyden. So even within Flemish painting, Bruges was a kind of place where traditions met and got mixed up in order to produce, of course, new works. This, of course, the beauty of the jewels represented here by Memling remind us of the fact that Bruges was not just the town of cloth and the producing and the selling of cloth. It was also inevitably a place where wealth attracted highly exquisite craftsmanship, and that the wife of the banker representing the Medici Bank in Bruges was able to sport jewels of great splendor like this one. Now, Memling, as we know, was a man who originally came from Germany. What we can see here, which is very interesting, is in complete opposition with the doctrine of Florentine painting. So it's interesting to see that Bruges is at the same time completely connected with Florence and Genoa, but Florence is more important in the history of painting than Genoa. But at the same time, of course, Bruges, with Memling, and not just with Memling, but particularly with Memling, is able to maintain anti-Florentine laws of composition. Since here, a kind of ideal, imagined representation of Jerusalem, and the various parts of Jerusalem are used to represent scenes of the Passion. It starts, of course, on the left with the representation of the Last Supper, right? And it ends up on the right with the representation of the risen Christ, of resurrection. And whereas Florentine composition imposed a single scene in a single space, in a single moment of time, seen by a single eye, here we have multi-spatial and multi-temporal representation. And what, of course, the combination of the bottom left-hand side of the painting, where we can see Christ arrested in the wood of olive trees outside Jerusalem, with the agony of Christ, the prayer on the left-hand side, a little bit over the scene of the arrest. What is probably interesting is that this painting, which challenges the modern definition of painting in Florence, one scene, one time, one space, one eye, this painting was commissioned by the patron we see on the bottom extreme left of the painting, and in whom we recognize once again Tommaso Portinari. So, in fact, Portinari did not just commission his portrait and the portrait of his wife, but he also commissioned, of course, this very famous masterpiece by Memling, now in the Galleria Sabauda in Turin in Italy. And we can see that not only did, in a way, Portinari bring to Bruges his own preoccupations of art in the Florentine manner, but he was able to accept other ways of defining composition in paintings by the fact that he commissioned, of course, this masterpiece by Memling, right? And we can see that on the right-hand side of the painting, at the bottom, where we can see Christ falling under the weight of the cross and Christ risen up there on the right emerging from his tomb, we see again at the bottom on the right the donor's wife, the commissioner's wife, Maria Portinari, already seen, of course, in the double portrait earlier on. Now, this is another portrait of Portinari, which is to be found no longer in a painting by Memling, but in a painting by Hugo van der Goes. So you realize to what extent Bruges was central in the development of European art, because the presence of these extremely wealthy Italian bankers, merchants, etc., who knew about the development of art in Florence, but were nevertheless fascinated by another form of modernism which they encountered in Bruges. Now, this was painted by a man called Hugo van der Goes. You may know or you may not know that Hugo van der Goes has been described by Rudolf Wittkower, one of the most famous art critics of the second half of the 20th century, as the first artiste maudit. We know that van der Goes went mad, and this has made of van der Goes the first personality in art to combine the notion of vision and the notion of madness, a kind of enlightened madness. And in this triptych, which represents the adoration of the shepherds, as we shall see in a minute, again, we have, of course, on the left-hand side, Tommaso Portinari and his two sons, and on the right-hand side, Maria Portinari and their daughter. Now, when the triptych is closed, because you know that all triptychs are closed during the week, they are open only on Sundays and on great sacred holidays, we have something which is very important, an annunciation, of course, that we can recognize, but we have here painting imitating sculpture. Because don't forget that in those days, in particular in Florence, there was a debate which was known as the Paragon debate. The question was, which is the paragon of all arts? Which is the most important of all arts? Sculpture or painting? And it was a kind of game on the part of painters to show that painting could imitate sculpture in a way that probably sculpture could not imitate painting. But that's another story. And in the painting itself, we see, of course, now I was telling you about Hugo van der Goes a minute ago. This is probably van der Goes's last final painting. It represents the death of the Virgin Mary. It's now in the Gronin Museum in Bruges. And of course, what is so moving in this absolutely amazing painting is, though of course we see Christ coming down from heaven to receive, of course, the soul of his mother, for the disciples, the moment is almost totally tragic, because it means that their last link with physical Christ, with their physical master, their last link is suddenly vanishing and disappearing. Now they have moved from visible contact into invisible, into faith in the invisible. And if we look carefully at details of the painting, we can see the element of grief and the element of despair almost, which seems suddenly to seize the disciples. And the tradition of art criticism as recognized in the face of the disciple, which is radically right underneath St. Peter's right hand, we've been led, or we are told that this, in fact, this man who is almost grabbing with his fingers the dress of the Virgin Mary, this man would in fact be, or is in fact supposed to be, a self-portrait of the painter Hugo van der Goes, who, as I have explained, went mad and then retired into a huge monastery situated not very far from Bruges. Now, if we go back to the painting by Hugo van der Goes, it's, of course, you can see it's magnificent. We have, of course, Tommaso Portinari and his two sons, presented by St. Thomas, accompanied by St. Anthony, and the marvelous detail, of course, is at the top, where we can see Joseph and Mary arriving in Bethlehem for the birth of Christ, right? They have been traveling. Mary, of course, is suffering because she's nearing the end of the 9 months before she can give birth to Christ. And on the right-hand side, of course, we have Maria Portinari with quite probably Mary Magdalene on the right-hand side, and probably another saint who must be Saint Marguerite, Saint Margarita, with the dragon that she's crushing under her foot on the left here. What else can we say here? We move on, and of course, in the central scene, in the central panel, we have the juxtaposition of Mary, Child Christ, the angels, Saint Joseph, and the shepherds themselves. Now, one thing which I haven't said, and which I must immediately say because it's very important, it's the first oil painting ever to have reached Florence. Before the arrival of the Adoration of the Shepherds by Ugo van der Goes, Florence was under the domination of tempera. Tempera means dissolving the pigments in the white and the yolk of eggs. And tempera allows for no pentimento. That is, you cannot change what you have painted when it is painted with tempera, whereas with oil you can. And oil produces a kind of mimetic representation of material details, like, for instance, clothes, materials, complexions, the softness of air, etc., which, of course, tempera does not allow for. And when this painting, sent by Tommaso Portinari from Bruges to Florence, arrived in Florence, it came as an enormous shock to the painting community in Florence, because it suddenly revealed that tempera, in a way, was on the verge of archaism, and that modernity came with oil from Bruges. So if you remember what we have said before, which is very important, we had a Memling using an archaic method of composition, though he was commissioned by a Florentine. And we now have, of course, in Florence, which normally in the field of composition is more modern than Bruges, we have in the field of painting material an archaism which something coming from Bruges is going to allow the Florentine people to overcome. Now, of course, we can only admire the extraordinary quality of the painting here, in particular the almost transparent water in the glass with the we won't go into all the symbolical details of the flowers because it would be too long. You can see, of course, that in a way the sheaf of corn here announces the bread of passion, and that very evidently the irises are like daggers, which will later on, of course, be used to pierce the heart of Christ. But I want to insist on, rather than the symbolism of the flowers, which is quite easy to find everywhere, is the majolica. The majolica, which is present here, reminds us of the fact that Italy developed majolica from contacts with late Arabic Spain. And again here, we have in this painting that comes from Flanders to Tuscany, we have also pointed out the inevitable and extremely developed commercial, therefore artistic and intellectual links with Spain, but a Spain which was still partly occupied by, of course, Muslims. So we have really in Bruges a kind, once again, of picture of globalization. Now, this is very important. This is probably the first time in Italian representation or in representation in Italy that such a measure of realism was reached in the representation of human faces. That is to say, the reproduction of reality became more important than the creation of beauty. Or, beauty could not be divorced from reality. Beauty was not an anti-reality. And this is what, of course, the painting by Hugo van der Goes brought to Florence. And you have to realize, of course, that the three shepherds on the right could not have existed in Florence without the three shepherds on the left. The three shepherds on the left come from Hugo van der Goes, we have already seen. The three shepherds on the right are by Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most famous late 15th century Florentine painters and fresco creators. So if we compare the heads of the shepherds in Hugo van der Goes's painting and the heads of the shepherds in the Pala of the Sassetti Chapel in Santa Trinita in Florence, we see that, of course, Ghirlandaio could never probably have indulged in this measure of realism without the influence of Hugo van der Goes. And what is, of course, again, very remarkable is the fact that in spite of this influence of Bruges, in the realism of the faces, in the kind of background that we can see here, which is evocative of the background of Hugo van der Goes's painting, the references to antiquity, the great garland on the tomb here, and of course the square columns and the square fluted columns, all these things come from Italian antiquity, and they have no place, of course, in the world of Flanders and Bruges. So what is interesting, once again, is this constant attempt at synthesis, at symbiosis between either the technical lessons or the cultural references and reminiscences. And we have here, of course, the comparison or the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the Hugo van der Goes on the left, and on the right-hand side, of course, the Ghirlandaio of the Sassetti Chapel. We have said that art commissions were largely dependent on the presence of a very strong economy in Bruges, based mainly on the production of cloth material, but also on commercialization, and finally, of course, on the presence of finance. The gradual drift, perhaps away from production and commercialization towards the supremacy of finance, which is characteristic of many developed economies, is probably evoked in a painting by Jan Provost, which is in the Groningen Museum in Bruges. We see that somebody who has been described as a miser, but also as a moneylender, therefore probably as a banker or a merchant, or a combination of both, is in fact presenting, of course, the total of his debt to a debtor, and suddenly, of course, the debtor is transformed allegorically into death, which means that there were people in Bruges who were capable of realizing that the presence of money, the omnipresence of money, which of course made possible the luxury, the artistic beauty, the architecture, etc. of the town, this was in fact also terribly dangerous, and that it threatened the very foundation, the very ethical foundations of the community living in Bruges. Now, all this, of course, was the result of the presence of money. And this presence of money is illustrated, of course, in this painting, which is in the Groningen Museum in Bruges. This is a kind of moral warning. This idea that when a whole community is obsessed by money, money lending, interest, etc., in the end, of course, the obsession with money and profit becomes a kind of essential ground for the development of a vision which announces 17th century Dutch vanities. The fact that you have a moneylender here or a banker who receives one of his clients and that finally the client turns into the allegorical figure of death means, of course, that the people who indulged in this passion for finance in Bruges, we already explained that production, commercialization and finance were the three aspects of the modernity of the economy. Here, of course, it seems to me that very early on, Bruges was able to understand that the domination by the financial of the realms of both production and or commercialization led to a kind of inevitable death. Here we have, of course, a third Italian town represented in Bruges. It's absolutely amazing. A man called Dino de Rapondi, who was in fact the official banker to to the Duke, the first ever Duke of Burgundy, at least in the Valois dynasty, Philip the Bold, and Dino de Rapondi was his banker. This is a preparatory drawing for a statue of Rapondi, which was originally sculpted to be put on the side of Duke Philip the Bold's tomb, and we are going to come back to that in a minute. The statue was apparently visible until the French Revolution and was then destroyed. So you see that Rapondi is important because, of course, he was banker to Philip the Bold and to his son, John the Fearless, who was murdered at the Montreux Bridge by a certain number of rather disreputable men sent by the future King of France when he was the Dauphin Charles VII. But it was John the Fearless, the second Duke of Burgundy in the Valois dynasty, whom we can see here on the right. It was John the Fearless who asked Rapondi to pay for the funeral procession that brought back the corpse of Philip the Bold here from Flanders to Burgundy. Philip the Bold had been intelligent enough to marry a girl called Marguerite de Mal, who was the daughter of the Count of Flanders. And so being Duke of Burgundy, he inherited through his wife Flanders, therefore producing probably one of the wealthiest nations or states, right, in medieval Europe. And Philip the Bold was a Valois, right? His brother was King Charles V of France. And Philip the Bold, of course, was not king. But he knew, of course, that French kings were all buried in an abbey outside Paris called Saint-Denis. And Philip the Bold, being Duke of Burgundy, was a little bit jealous of the fact that French kings were buried in an abbey. So he decided that he would build outside Dijon, the capital of the Duchy of Burgundy, a monastery. It was not an abbey, it was a charter house. And this charter house was known as the Chartreuse de Champmolles. And he decided that this Chartreuse de Champmolles would be the Burgundian Saint-Denis. The dukes would all be buried, one after the other, buried in the same place, in the Chartreuse de Champmolles. And Dino de Rapondi's statue was put next to Philip the Bold's grave in the Chartreuse de Champmolles in order to recognize and to thank him for the fact that he had paid for the transfer of the corpse of Philip the Bold, having died in Flanders, to Champmolles, which meant dozens of churches being decorated on the way with cloth from Lucca, the Italian town from which Rapondi came. So you can see this combination of ritual, this combination of religion, this combination of quasi-monarchical power, and this combination of money. Rapondi was prepared to pay, instead of the duke of the duke's son, for the duke's father's funeral, for the duke's father's funeral. And Rapondi was prepared to pay, provided, of course, it meant work for the people of his native town, Lucca. Now, Champmol is an exceptional place which has disappeared today. Why do we come to this statue here now? Simply because this is a statue by Michelangelo. And this statue by Michelangelo can be found in the church of Notre Dame of Our Lady in Bruges. It was brought back from Italy by a Bruges merchant banker who had spent a few years working in Rome. And you can see that this, again, is at the center of what I'm trying to explain. This idea that Bruges figures prominently in the development of European culture because Flemish paintings were sent from Bruges to Italian Renaissance and modified the vision Florentine painting had of itself, but also works were brought back from Italy, which completely changed, of course, the canons of art in Flanders. This is, of course, the famous church of Notre Dame, painted by, or drawn rather by Knopf, already mentioned several times at the beginning of this presentation. Here you can see, of course, the back of the Église Notre Dame in Bruges. So the Church of Our Lady in Bruges is interesting not only because it reveals that there was a kind of cross-fecundation which came from Flanders to Italy, but also which moved from Italy to Flanders, as we've seen with the presence of this statue by young Michelangelo. But the Church of Our Lady is also interesting because it is the burying place of the last two members of the Valois dynasty of Burgundy. So far, if we look very quickly at this genealogical table, we have already evoked Charles V of France, his brother, who became Philip II the Bold, the first Duke of Burgundy in the Valois family, then his son John the Fearless, and we are now going to spend a few minutes on the last two members of the dynasty, Charles the Reckless at the bottom, and his, unfortunately for him, only daughter, Mary of Burgundy, whom we are going to say a few more things about in the next, with the next few slides. In fact, the center of the choir of the Church of Our Lady is occupied by two graves, two tombs, that of Charles the Reckless, who died more or less devoured by wolves at the end of the siege of the failed siege of Nancy. What was left of his body by the wolves was brought back to his daughter, Mary of Burgundy, and she organized the burial of her father in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, and she planned for her own burial in the same church. Little did she probably know or envisage that her own burial would come fairly soon after her father's. In fact, she was left probably the most desirable heiress in the whole of Europe. She had in her hands Burgundy and Flanders. Louis XI of France tried to marry her. She was not particularly keen. And of course, when he realized that she would not marry him, he seized the French portion of Burgundy. And in order to escape Louis XI, Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian of Austria, future Emperor Maximilian I, and she therefore married into the Habsburg family, thus laying the foundation of the great opposition between the Valois and then the Bourbons, and on the other side, of course, the Habsburg. In this Church of Our Lady, we have a very interesting main altar painting by a painter called Bernard van Orley, which represents various scenes of the Passion of Christ. In the center, of course, a crucifixion. We see that Bernard van Orley, with the extremely agitated aesthetic of his painting, belongs to what is known as Northern Mannerism. And Bernard van Orley was the court painter to Margaret of Austria. Margaret of Austria was the daughter of Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian I. She was the aunt of Charles V, the Emperor and King of Spain under the title of Charles I. And Margaret of Austria is extremely important because after the death of her brother Philip and of her sister-in-law Jane the Mad, a Spanish princess, Margaret of Austria in fact brought up Charles V, and she brought him up to the conception he acquired through her of his role as Emperor and King of Spain. So she had an enormous influence over him, and in return for this influence, for which he was always grateful, she was made regent of the Low Countries by her nephew. We have here on the left-hand side Margaret of Austria, and we have an extract from a book of ours, one of the most remarkable forms of artistic commission that princes and princesses indulged in was, of course, books of ours, that is to say, missals or prayer books, which were stupendously illustrated by the greatest artists of their time in the form of course, miniatures or illuminations, as we can see here. Here, of course, we have a representation of Mary of Burgundy, the last, in a way, sovereign of Burgundy when it was united with Flanders. And we have, of course, the traditional form of artistic commissioning of great monarchs of the period, that is to say, books of ours. The great monarchs of the time commissioned from important artists books of ours, missals, books of prayers, the interest of which lay not so much, of course, in the text, but in the fantastic illustrations, miniatures, illuminations with which those books of ours and missals were adorned. And here, of course, we have a representation of Maximilian of Habsburg, Maximilian I, holding in his left hand a pomegranate, an emblem of fecundity, and on the left-hand side we have a kind of allegorical representation of the wedding, the marriage between Maximilian I, the Habsburg, and Mary of Burgundy. Thus, the link between Flanders, the Low Countries, Austria, Spain, and the future Spanish Empire in Central and South America, which, of course, led to the famous formula that Charles V's empire was an empire on which the sun never set. But if there had not been this marriage between Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, there would have been no empire on which the sun never set. This is Mary of Burgundy, her tomb in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges. And of course, this again puts Bruges at the center of European politics, right? In the end of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the beginning of modern times. Mary of Burgundy had hardly married Maximilian I, that she died in a hunting accident outside Bruges. And that's why, of course, she was buried in Bruges next to her father in the choir of the Church of Our Lady. And of course, if we go back in time Charles the Reckless, the father of Mary of Burgundy, was Philip the Good, the third great Duke of Burgundy, represented here with the Order of the Golden Fleece. And we have to remember that this Order of the Golden Fleece, perhaps the most famous order of chivalry in Europe, end of the Middle Ages, Renaissance, modern times, this Order of the Golden Fleece was created by Philip the Good in Bruges in 1430 on the occasion of his third marriage to Isabel of Portugal. And you have this magnificent miniature in which Philip the Good is represented with his son, Charles the Fearless, on his right. He is being presented a manuscript with illuminations, as we have said earlier. And of course, it represents this idea that one of the legitimizing aspects of the monarch is the fact that he is a patron of the arts and that his power, his political power, is legitimized by the fact that he can patronize the arts and he can commission important work of arts which become the illustration of. Next to him on the left, the famous chancellor, one of the greatest art commissioners of his time, Nicolas Rolin, the commissioner of the famous Vierge du Chancelier Rolin and the polyptych of the Last Judgment in the Hospice de Beaune, and on the left-hand side, Jean Chevreau, the Bishop of Tournai, who himself was born in Jura. So we have again this idea that in those days, Bruges was the capital of a kind of premonition of a united Europe. And at a time when the unity of Europe has become, of course, a central problem with the re-emergence of provincial separatisms around Scotland or Catalonia, we may be on our way to a kind of Europe which was built on a union of old provinces rather than a union of 19th century nation states. Here we have, of course, Charles the Reckless, the last of the great dukes of Burgundy, presiding over the chapter of the Knights of the Golden Fleece. And this commissioning of the art is extremely important. This is a reliquary which was given anonymous. We don't know who the artist is, but it was a reliquary which was commissioned by Charles the Reckless. And it represents, of course, Charles kneeling to present the relic of a saint. And he is accompanied by the patron saint of all medieval knights, St. George. And you can see that St. George is raising his hat. And if your memory is any good, you will remember that in the painting by Jan van Eyck of Canon van der Paal, St. George was also raising his hat. So the gesture in the reliquary commissioned for Liège by Charles the Reckless comes directly from a painting commissioned for a church in Bruges by a canon commissioned to Jan van Eyck. And again, we have this idea of constant circulation. We tend to think that the development of communication is particularly characteristic of the 21st century. When you start looking more precisely at the past, and at a certain distant past, one remains amazed by the amount of visibility and communication that existed already at the time. You can see the similarity between the two gestures. And if I can go a little further for a minute, I said something very stupid earlier on. I said that antiquity, the cultural presence of antiquity was particularly characteristic of Italian and particularly Florentine Renaissance. In fact, the gesture of St. George raising his helmet, or his hat, but more probably a helmet, comes directly from the Iliad of Homer. When Hector goes to see his wife Andromache for the last time, she is holding their son Astyanax in their arms. And Homer told us that Astyanax did not recognize his father and therefore began to cry. and his father had to raise his helmet so that, of course, Astyanax would recognize him and would stop crying. Now, of course, in the painting by Jan van Eyck, St. George raises his helmet so that child of Christ will not be frightened and will not cry. And this gesture of St. George raising his helmet is copied by the sculptor, the craftsman, who produced the reliquary of Liège, commissioned by Charles V. And you see, we have here things which are absolutely amazing. How an artist in Bruges, supposed not to be concerned with the Renaissance as the return of antiquity, is nevertheless quoting pictorially Homer and is copied later on by a sculptor for a religious work given by an emperor to the Cathedral of Liège. And this, of course, is the commissioned by a duke, for the Cathedral of Liège. And we have here, of course, the tomb, the grave of Charles the Reckless, the last of the great dukes of Burgundy. Let us end this presentation of Bruges with another aspect of Bruges modernity, which is, of course, communal authority and the responsibility of those who are in authority towards this community. What do we see here? Somebody evidently being arrested, right, on the left-hand side. Somebody being arrested. Now, these two paintings are by a late Bruges painter, somebody who worked at the end of the 15th, early 16th century, called, Gérard David. Those paintings, those two paintings, belong to a genre, to a tradition, to a topos of painting in those days. They were called the tableaux de justice, paintings of justice. They were usually put in the main assembly hall of the guild hall or town hall of the towns of the Flemish towns. We have an example, for instance, of two paintings of justice that were painted for Leuven, right, and which are now presented in Brussels. And the idea was that in those paintings, the administrators of the town, the municipal councillors, were reminded of the fact that if they did not discharge their duties honestly, they would be punished. So, in fact, you've heard probably of what a memento mori is. Remember that you must die, right? Which produced the types of paintings that we called vanities. But those paintings of justice were there to remind those who were in authority and usually had been elected by people in the city that if they did not discharge their duties correctly and honestly, they would be punished for that. And here, of course, we have a judge who is being arrested, perhaps we know in fact that it is by a representative of Emperor Alexander the Great. But you see that there is absolutely no attempt at a historical reconstruction. The painting, if the event took place in antiquity, which it is supposed to have taken place in, it is in fact projected into contemporary times. And we have a judge who could be arrested on orders from Emperor Charles V or a Duke of Burgundy, etc. Now, why is he arrested? Because we can see at the back that he has accepted to be corrupted. He has accepted to be bribed into rendering a judgment favorable to somebody but unfavorable to the innocent. What is very striking is that at the back, behind the column, we have a topographical representation of Bruges. Anybody living in Bruges in those days would have recognized the building which is at the back of the painting. It was probably the chapel where a relic containing a kind of small flask containing what was supposed to be the holy blood of Christ was preserved, right? And, of course, inevitably, what is supposed to take place in antiquity is more and more rooted in daily, late 15th century, early 16th century reality of Bruges. You can see, of course, that the influence of Italy is enormous. The medallions representing other forms of judgment into which we will not go now. The putti, right, and the garlands, they come directly from antiquity. Andrea Mantegna was using the same kind of decoration in Mantua at the same time. And of course, since he has been arrested, he has to be punished. And he is being flayed alive. He is being, of course, skinned alive, right? And at the back, the details are extremely interesting. Because don't forget that in those days, dissection was forbidden by the church, right? And we have here a new form of knowledge. That is to say, we see that in Bruges, people are beginning to think that knowing about the body should not come from believing, but from experiencing. So it's not a belief which comes from, it's not a knowledge that comes from books or from belief, from dogma, but it's a knowledge that comes from experience. And again, Bruges is very important. If Gérard David was able to paint a painting like this for the Municipal Council of Bruges, if the painting was actually hung in the main council hall, council chamber of this municipal council, this implied not just a moral lesson, but it's also an epistemological lesson. You should not learn about your body from dogma, you should learn about it from experience. And the terrible detail, of course, and you can see that people are talking, are discussing, right? Later on, Rembrandt will paint anatomy lessons which will be completely derived from, of course, this representation of Gérard David. And on the right-hand side, you can see the son of the judge who has succeeded his father, seated on his father's chair, but on the chair you have the father's skin, to remind the son of the fact that if he does what his father has done, that is to say, if he betrays the trust of the citizens of Bruges, he will know the same fate as his father. And you can see that this idea of people being flayed alive because they had betrayed the trust of their of the citizens was a common subject in those days, since we have here on the left-hand side the son with the flesh of the skin of his father and the head of his father above, and the father being flayed here at the bottom on the right. Now, Bruges, of course, was part of the Habsburg possessions. Here on the left, you have Maximilian I. On the right, you have Mary of Burgundy, his wife. Next to his mother, you have Philip the Beautiful, who married Jane, the Mad Girl. And Jane the Mad Girl was, of course, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. So she, Jane the Mad, brought Spain, right? And of course, here you have in the middle Charles V. On his left, his brother Ferdinand. On his right, his sister Mary of Austria. Now, of course, Charles V was the son of Philip the Beautiful and Jane the Mad, right, the Spanish daughter of the Catholic kings. So you see, Maximilian brought Austria, Mary brought the Flanders, Jane the Mad brought Spain, and beyond Spain, of course, South America. When Charles I of Spain, fifth of the empire, abdicated to go to a monastery in Extremadura called Yuste. He gave the imperial crown to his brother Ferdinand, and their sister had married the king of Hungary. So, in a way, in Bruges, you have, of course, all the connections and all the links that make, in a way, modern Europe. And there was, at the same time, a kind of local life which was characterized by the double preoccupation, modern preoccupation of justice, accountability, responsibility, knowledge through experience rather than through dogma, and also because Bruges was part of Flanders, it was linked not just by production, commerce and art, but also by politics and the exercise of power to the rest of modern Europe.